Howdy, harbingers of doom and unrepented souls. Now, let me ask you a little something here. Have you ever stared deep into the endless, fiery maw of hell itself, seeing the eternal damnation that awaits those souls spiced with sin, ready to rend their miserable existences asunder, and thought, man, I just want to jump down there with a big stick and start smacking people at the behest of a whiny child? Well, worry no more, because Koei Tecmo's first foray into the roguelite genre, Warriors Abyss, has you covered. Quick backstory on this game, and I do mean quick. This game was revealed just a few weeks ago at the most recent Sony State of Play, and shadow dropped immediately after the show, much to my excitement. You see, while I'm not the hugest Dynasty Warriors fan in the world, I actually do enjoy the Muso style of hack and slash. I sunk countless hours into both Hyrule Warriors games, and even got into One Piece again thanks to the Pirates Warriors series of spin-offs. And I've absolutely fallen in love with roguelites in the past few years thanks to both the first Hades and Aggro Crab's Going Under, which by the way, you should absolutely check out if you get the chance, especially if you know anything about the world of tech startups, because there's some jokes in there that will both cut to the soul and have you laughing on your ass all at once if you do. So the idea of making a roguelike game using the Muso style of combats and upgrades sounded like a match made in heaven, which is a little ironic that the game's set in hell, but you know. So once I finally moved into my new place and got all nice and settled in, I beat the game and I gave my thoughts on it some time to stew before coming back to write this review. So does this Muso mashup rise to the godly heights that the roguelite genre can reach, or does it belong amongst the underworld's flames rather than in your gaming library? Well, let's find out as we examine both the honorable and the hellish that this game has to offer as Krank Critiques Warriors Abyss. Starting off with the story, it gets the job done I guess, but there's not much of it honestly. The Great King of Hell, Enma, has been overthrown by the evil god Goma, who drained the king's power and turned him into a Genshin character in the process. Truly a fate worse than death. Now helpless to reclaim his throne, the king has summoned a living soul, who the player controls, to fight through hell on his behalf and defeat Goma. Along the way, the player uses magic trees called crystal saplings to summon familiar faces from across the Dynasty Warrior series to help wade through the seemingly endless hordes of restless souls and vile demons that Goma has at his disposal. As you get deeper into hell, Enma will occasionally pitch in to offer commentary on your progress and shed light to his feelings about the situation. Surprise, he ain't too happy about watching the realm he once ruled get turned upside down by a bunch of fucked up monster things. While there are dialogue options that offer variety as to how you respond to Enma, it's merely an illusion of choice because no matter what option you choose, they all amount to the same response and the story will carry on either way. There's no variability into how your relationship with Enma can go. While these bits of Enma are occasionally cute as you begin to appreciate the player's efforts the deeper they push into hell, it's pretty easy to forget about the story during most of your play sessions. Just mash A through Enma's dialogue and push forward. And admittedly, I found the lackluster story a little disappointing since the cyclical, ever-changing nature of roguelites can lend themselves to some really compelling slow burn stories that play out in between or over multiple runs, and King Enma's struggles with feeling of inadequacy and failure for letting Goma get the best of him could have made for some simple yet compelling character work. And speaking of Goma for that matter, he's an absolute non-presence as a villain. Neither he nor any of the demons under his command even have a single line of dialogue in the entire game. Goma and his forces may as well be a pack of rabid animals that need putting down for all you care. Hell, that's essentially the player's role in the story. You show up, bonk Goma back to sleep, then get a little goodbye from King Enma for your trouble. Overall, the story left me sort of wanting by the time I reached credits. I understand that not every game needs to be Disco Elysium. Engaging gameplay can make a so-so story feel like less of a drawback. It's not like anyone cares about the deep story of fucking Pac-Man, well, except Namco apparently, but I do wish Abyss put a little more focus on its narrative elements. Maybe give Goma and his forces more of a sense of character and make you know why he's invading the demon realm, other than the fact that he was put to sleep millions of years ago. And for that matter, why did the previous kings put him to sleep? What made him a quote-unquote god of evil? Like, any sense of character at all would have been an improvement here. And it's not just the story where the game's lacking, it also ain't much to write home about in terms of art style either. All 4 levels of hell rigidly stick to one theme. First is fire, then ice, then swampy green area, and then finally a boardwalk area covered in black sludge like Venom had an accidental discharge over a pier. Unfortunately, nothing actually tangibly changes area to area other than the aesthetics, so any visual identity the game manages to achieve is purely from the playable characters themselves. Their various attacks all have a sense of flair and bombast to them. There's a character that uses a literal boat as a weapon and thus all his attacks are giant waves. Liu Bao's attacks are accompanied by vibrant geysers of flame bursting from the ground to really accentuate his power. If nothing else, each character feels appropriately exaggerated for a Muso game, and I ended up unlocking a good amount of the roster just to see what insane moves they pulled out next. Fuck, there's one slightly unassuming character named Motonari who I initially underestimated until he started firing fucking unibeams at enemies and firebombing him to oblivion. It's insanely fun to use and satisfying to just blow enemies away with that kind of power. So if nothing else, the playable casts do help elevate the visuals a bit, but still incredibly bland looking for the most part, especially when you're actually running through these various areas and noticing the same rooms repeating over and over again. While most roguelites do repeat rooms obviously, some of them do go out of their way to make sure they feel different at the very least and mix it up by giving you different rest spots or areas with NPCs or even just small visual differences so you're not looking at the same thing over and over again each run. And this feeling of monotony doesn't just apply to the visuals, it permeates throughout the entire game. The basic gameplay loop is about what you'd expect from a Musou game. Pick a character, hop into a map, and bash your way through a hordes of enemies, along the way charging your Musou gauge to build up a giant attack that can clear out much larger groups of enemies at once. And side note, I do love that Musou attacks send enemies flying into the screen a la Turtles in Time. It's just so unimaginably satisfying to send these goobers hurtling away, but I digress. The playable cast of warriors also serve a dual role in the game since all of them can also be recruited as summons during your run for both passive effects to improve your abilities and combo extending summon attacks to help clear out the often massive clusters of demons standing between you and the sweet peach of victory. Not to mention each hero comes with a unique set of emblems that provide their own unique buffs, like making your dodges invincible or making your attack slightly stronger. The more of a certain emblem you build up, then the further you move up its effect tree and get even better benefits. You can also charge up this yellowed bar at the bottom of your screen to summon all of your partnered warriors at once to clear out a room or do massive damage to a boss. Speaking of which, there's 4 bosses you have to fight before you can actually get to Goma himself, and they all roughly follow the same pattern. Dodge their attacks until they do one that leaves them vulnerable, denoted by them flashing yellow, then use a strong or summon attack to break down their barrier. Once their barrier is down, you can do real damage to them. Admittedly, each boss feels a little tedious since the barriers take way too long to actually come down, and it means you're spending a lot of time before you can even make real progress in the fight. The barriers only serve to make the bosses feel more like a challenge of my patience than my skill or build, and by the time I was done with the game, they were easily the most tedious part of it for me. Other than the bosses though, combat does have a simple yet satisfying loop at first. I'll admit that the spectacle of clearing out hundreds of enemies in a single room did hook me when I first started playing the game, as it does when I play most Warriors games. The only problem is that spectacle is really the only string to this game's bow. With other Warriors titles, there's also a sense of strategy along with the combat. You have to oversee your troops, take bases, make sure to protect important figures on your side, and eliminate powerful enemies leading the opposing forces. Warriors Abyss doesn't have any of that, so it's relying way more on the combat to keep you engaged, which would be fine, except again, you're going for the same rooms, fighting the same bosses, and doing the same stuff over and over again, meaning that even though the combat is fun, you're ultimately doing it to the same ends each and every time. Not to mention, even though the combat is fun, it's also very button mashing. You have 1 or 2 combos that work, using your summon attacks to take out a few more enemies, and then use your Musou attack once it's charged. There's no real skill ceiling or level of improvement to strive for. All the things that make you better at combat are only passive buffs that change stats, and not actually the way you approach enemies. Even with such a huge roster at your disposal, the combat ends up getting stale after a while, which is a big mark against the game since combat is such an integral aspect to the experience, and everything around that combat isn't all that varied either, so the whole experience ends up feeling rather shallow at the end of the day. Credit where it's due, there is at least a little variety in the form of occasional side missions that task you with eliminating certain enemies or clearing out a certain number of enemies in exchange for a reward. There's also little text boxes called Memories of the Dead that will place a small scenario in front of you and force you to make a decision that places some sort of modifier on you for the next few rooms. For instance, you may remember being trapped in a wildfire and have to choose between resisting your imminent death, which earns reduced cooldown on your summon attacks but takes 10% of your health, or simply accept the fact that you're about to be extra crispy and only lose 5% of your health while earning 500 karmic embers as a reward for laying the forces that be, turning into a campfire roasted delicacy for shits and giggles, I guess. I don't really know why just letting yourself burn to death is rewarded, but sure. Oh, that actually brings me to one of the most important aspects of the game, the karmic embers and the Hall of Bonded Souls. The Hall essentially acts like both a character unlock and skill tree mixed into one, since you use the embers that you earn throughout your many runs through various methods, from defeating enemies to completing missions, and as mentioned before, occasionally getting someone from Memories of the Dead to earn new characters to come with permanent buffs to the entire cast, such as increased attack or defense. You can also improve certain conditions for your next run, like making it so healing items are more effective, or increasing the amount of embers you get each run. Now, with all that said, you think all of those systems would help add a bit of depth to Warrior Abyss's gameplay, but it doesn't really do much to stop the game from feeling samey at the end of the day. I think it's the fact that there's a lot of little changes you can make, but not a lot of big ones when it comes to the runs. I know it's weird to complain about the repetition in a roguelite, but when it comes to this genre, you have to maintain a sense of variety, switching up the bosses you face and the environments you go running through. The key to a good roguelite is taking the familiar and remixing it until it feels new again, and Warriors Abyss just doesn't accomplish that. You see the reused elements in the same spaces just a few too many times to keep you on your toes, or make you want to jump in for another run. The game shows this entire hand just a little too quickly for my liking. Even beating Goma only offers slight modifiers to change what items drop, nothing that fundamentally changes your first run from the 50th other than what stats you got backing you or what character you're playing as. In conclusion, for all the potential Warriors Abyss had to be this unique marriage of the Musou and roguelite genres, it ultimately feels pretty shallow as far as both gameplay styles go. While the game isn't bad by any means, it lacks a lot of the little details and features that its more well-rounded contemporaries use to keep their player bases engaged. It's as if the devs at Koei Tecmo are dipping their toes into the roguelite pool, but aren't quite confident enough to dive into the deep end just yet and use everything this genre has to offer. Still, for what it's worth, there is fun to be had here thanks to a huge unlockable roster and a few interesting wrinkles here and there that let you switch up your strategy, albeit in a very subtle fashion. But even with that in mind, Warriors Abyss doesn't do enough to keep you hooked beyond its initial premise of a roguelite Musou hybrid, hoping that the novelty of playing a roguelite where the enemies number in the hundreds will be enough to spice up what is otherwise a bland and repetitive experience. There is groundwork for what could be a really enjoyable mixture of niches here, and I hope this game does well enough that Koei's devs take what they have here, really flesh it out in the future, and take some pointers from the works of devs like Aggro Crab and Supergiant, along with injecting some of their own original ideas into the mix to make something truly special. But as for Warriors Abyss as it is now, maybe wait for a sale before picking this up, because the fun to be had here isn't worth the $25 price tag, especially when the much better Hades 2 is only $5 more and is in early access, meaning it still has oodles of content to come. If you're looking for a game to scratch that roguelite itch, then there's my recommendation. Well, that and Splintered Fate because I'm a huge Ninja Turtles mark, but that's a story for another day. Warriors Abyss may not be vile enough for the depths of hell, but it's certainly no heavenly gift either, so it's best to leave this one stuck in purgatory. Well, that's the end of yet another run. For more news, reactions, streams, and reviews, be sure to like this vid, subscribe to my channel, and always remember to crank up the noise.